Now, this expert lesson plan is the third tier in a series of EndNote classes we offer each month. Attendees of this webinar should be able to demonstrate expert-level knowledge required to master EndNote's more powerful features, such as library syncing and library sharing, and workflows for customizing reference formatting. Today, we'll start by creating an EndNote Online account. You know, EndNote Online is sort of the web-based solution in the EndNote ecosystem. Some users only have a free what's called EndNote Basic account, and you can get a pretty basic research paper done with it. But when you have EndNote Desktop, you can also utilize EndNote Online for some additional functionality, specifically that library syncing and library sharing features. So we're going to start by creating an account via myendnoteweb.com. Back in EndNote 20, we'll sync our preferred EndNote library so that the contents of that desktop library and the web library are merged. And then I'll show you the steps involved for syncing a library on a second or third installation. Typically, an EndNote license allows you to install the software on up to 3 computers at any given time, Windows or macOS, as long as you're the the intended user of those installations. And so once you've synced the library on your first computer, there's a specific workflow that you would want to walk through to sync references, sync a library on a second or third computer where you've also installed EndNote. Once we've synced that library, I'll show you how you can share that library with up to 100 other EndNote desktop users. That would grant those sharees access to the entire library, and you can assign, varying levels of permissions to each of your sharees. Now, if you only wanted to share a portion of your library, maybe a subset of references for a particular project, you also have the ability to share a specific custom group within your synced library. Group sharing takes place via EndNote Online, and so I'll show you both examples, an example of sharing an entire library, also sharing a particular group, and point out how the two options or the two solutions compare and contrast. Like I mentioned, whether it be library sharing or group sharing, you can give each of your sharees a varying level of access rights, so that if you have someone who just needs to search and cite from a library or a group, you could give them read-only access. But if you have another user, a colleague who might need to contribute or make changes to your references, you can give that person read and write access. One of the benefits of library sharing in EndNote Desktop is that you have an interface or a feature called the activity feed, which shows you 500 of the most recent changes made by your sharing team, and you get sort of almost like an audit trail. It tells you, the activity feed will tell you who made a change to the library and when that change was made. And in some cases, you can actually click on one of those items on the activity feed to see the references that were impacted or part of that change that was made. So I'll show you how you can review the activity feed. We'll look at how you can, customize a connection file. Connection files are the type of content file in EndNote that allows EndNote to establish a connection with a remote database to query for new scholarly materials, new research materials to add to your EndNote library. In some cases, if the remote database administrator makes a change to their connection settings, our EndNote connection file can become out of date if they don't let us know. And in that scenario, we would typically only find out when, an end user, a regular EndNote user lets us know, lets our product support team know. So that's something we've got a content team of experts that manage our content files, updating, filters, styles, and connections, and creating new content files as well. But I'm going to walk you through some sort of self-help tips where you might be able to identify updated connection settings for one of these Z39.50 compliant databases, in which case you may be able to actually update the connection file yourself and sort of restore that connectivity so that EndNote can connect to and query that remote database again. I'll walk you through downloading a new output style from our website. When you install EndNote, we include about 500 of our most popular output styles, but we've got just over 7,000 styles available to download at endnote.com. Other publishers and other EndNote users can also host custom styles on other websites as well. So regardless of the source of a custom style, the steps that I'll walk you through for downloading a style and adding it to your EndNote installation would be the same regardless of the source of that EndNote connection file. I'll walk through how you can also update an import filter, which is the type of content file that tells EndNote how to import consistently tagged data. There may be some instances where perhaps you want to override where some of that reference data is being imported into your library. So today we'll use a PubMed file, a text file exported from pubmed.gov, and we'll move a piece of data from one field to another, which is something that, again, you might want to do while you're importing data into EndNote so that you can have full control over where that information ends up in your library. And then finally, we'll look at a global edit feature in EndNote that allows you to, add information to multiple references at one time if you'd like, or copy or move information from one field to another. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about EndNote record numbers and sort of why those are unique per EndNote library. And I'll show you, in some cases, you might have, print materials related to some of the contents of your EndNote library, and you might want to sort of set up a filing system for these physical, perhaps, printed articles that you're in possession of. And so in some cases, we might have EndNote users who use that EndNote record number to sort of jumpstart a filing system. Since EndNote's already assigning a sequential number to your library entries, that's sometimes a great basis for a filing system if you'd like. So I'll show you how you can use change, move, copy fields to copy the record number from each one of your EndNote library records into an actual field that exists in your EndNote library records. So with that said, we're ready to dive in. I'm going to go ahead and close out of my PowerPoint presentation here. And I should be, actually just want to jump over to Firefox here, where I've already navigated to the EndNote online login page. Now you can see here at the top of the page, I've already inputted the URL, the address for this site. Now when you load this, if I go ahead and press return, it does take you to sort of a more complex address for the login page, a little bit harder to remember. So again, if you were looking to navigate directly to this page outside of EndNote, I would just navigate to myendnoteweb.com. It'll redirect you to the longer URL for the login page. Again, if you did not yet have an EndNote online account, you can create an account for free here. Almost anyone in the world can create a free EndNote account. We would call that an EndNote basic account. It's really got in terms of functionality, it's a limited feature set compared to a full EndNote online account or an EndNote desktop installation. But again, can get a pretty basic research paper done with an EndNote basic account. You can store up to 50,000 references and up to 2 gigabytes worth of file attachments. So again, get a pretty basic research paper done. But when you've got EndNote desktop, you can utilize the online interface to sort of power a couple of features in the desktop version of EndNote. So again, if you have purchased an EndNote desktop license or if you have access to it through your school or work, I would still create an account. You'll be doing most of your work in EndNote desktop to take advantage of all of those power features. But again, the online interface will give you some additional functionality. Now, like I mentioned, you can register for an account here. When you're creating an account, you have the choice to link it to an existing Facebook account or a LinkedIn account, so you can use those same credentials to log in from the web. But I did want to mention when you're inputting or linking your EndNote online account in EndNote desktop, or you're trying to maybe use the EndNote online site while you write commands in Microsoft Word, you still would have and need to remember an underlying email address and password for this EndNote online account. So it is a great idea, if you want to speed up the login process from the web, to link your EndNote online account so that you can sign up, log in with either your Facebook or LinkedIn credentials. But if you do that, I would just either, if you have a password manager, be sure that you're noting the associated EndNote online email address and password, or jot that down somewhere, because again, you'll need those credentials when you're linking your account in EndNote desktop or using Site While You Write in Microsoft Word. Now, I've already got an account. I'm not going to walk through the account creation process today. It's pretty straightforward. You're just defining, your email address, where you could receive a password reset email if the need were ever to arise, and your preferred password. But I'm just going to go ahead and use my stored. Oh, I thought my credentials were stored here. Let me go ahead and type them in. All right. Save those, perfect. So once I've logged in, you'll see that I'm taken directly to my EndNote online library. And with EndNote Online, you just have one library. You can store, if you've got an EndNote basic account, like I mentioned, up to 50,000 references. If you link your online account to your desktop license, which I'll show you how to do that in just a moment, you can store pretty much theoretically unlimited. The true limit is less than 1 million records per EndNote online library. I don't think in my 20 years of working with EndNote I've seen anyone actually develop a library that large. So it's theoretically unlimited, but technically there is an upper limit. When you have an EndNote basic account, like I mentioned, you can store up to 2 gigabytes worth of file attachments in your online account. When you link your EndNote online account to a desktop license, your only limit really is how your storage space on your hard drive, because essentially if you're syncing your library, your PDF attachments and other file attachments will live in the cloud and also in your designated sync library. So again, if you've got an enhanced EndNote online account tied to a desktop license, in terms of file attachment storage for your enhancement period of 2 years, you pretty much have unlimited storage. The true limit would be how large your hard drive is. I'm going to go and just hide the Getting Started guide here just to show you. I've already got 10 references in this web library. You can see I've got a group here. And when I set up the sync feature in EndNote Desktop, not only will my desktop library information be sent up to EndNote Online, but anything that I might already have in EndNote Online is going to come down. It's sort of a two-way street. I did want to mention before we move on, that if you also have access to Web of Science, if you're at an institution with a Web of Science subscription, it's a good idea to use the same credentials for EndNote Online as you do for the Web of Science, because you'll have some additional functionality in Web of Science as well. I'm not able to log into it here from my Mac. I'm not on our VPN, but if you have the Web of Science account set up and you perform a search in the Web of Science, references that might already exist in your EndNote Online library, they'll show a little EN icon just to let you know within the search results if you've already captured some of those entries to save you from creating a duplicate reference. And again, if you're authenticated properly, when you come to the EndNote Online library, like I am here, if I have any references that are indexed by Web of Science, I would have some links to get back to those source records in Web of Science. I would have a link to related records indexed by the Web of Science. Those would be references that have at least one citation in common with whatever reference it is that I have stored here in my web library. I would also see dynamic time-cited information. So as other researchers are citing these works, we're indexing that information in Web of Science, and that count is, like I mentioned, dynamic. So as the citations continue to grow, you would see that impact, that influence shown in the time-cited label that would exist below each one of these references. I'm going to go ahead and leave Firefox up and running here, but I'm going to go switch over to EndNote 20 that I've already got up and running. And I'm not sure if you've attended any of our other EndNote 20 related webinars yet this month, but EndNote 20 for macOS just came out earlier this week. I'd say the biggest difference in EndNote 20 is our modernized and streamlined library interface. Our product team worked with a lot of longtime EndNote users, new EndNote users, and non-users, maybe researchers that are working with EndNote alternatives, to perform some focus group testing, and their feedback really informed our design decisions. And the changes that we've made here in EndNote 20 were overwhelmingly endorsed, and sort of the streamlining of the information that we show, even though it's a little bit more or less cluttered, I guess you could say, in terms of icons and things like that. These changes allow us to show more information front and center than we've ever been able to in the past. So this is a really good foundation for this new modern library interface. But with EndNote Desktop, you can work with multiple libraries if you'd like. You could make separate libraries for different projects that you're working on or focus areas in your field of study. We do recommend storing all of your research materials in a single EndNote library just to help streamline some various functions in the EndNote application. Specifically, defined duplicate search is a little bit more effective if everything's stored in the same library. So EndNote can't search across multiple libraries for references. And so if you do make separate libraries for different projects, if there is any overlap in the contents of those libraries, EndNote wouldn't be able to, again, search for duplicates across multiple libraries, where if everything was stored in one library, EndNote can pick up, any duplicate that might exist in that library. Same goes for just searching in general. Even if you're not searching for duplicates, EndNote can't search across multiple libraries, and so storing everything in a single EndNote library just to helps streamline the searching EndNote search capabilities. So, like I mentioned, it is your choice whether or not you work with one library or multiple libraries. But when you want to set up the EndNote sync feature available from EndNote X7 and on, you would have to pick one primary library that you're syncing with EndNote Online. So I've got my library open right now. I can always double check where this library exists before I sync, just in case. Here in EndNote 20, I can go to the library menu. I've got the library summary menu item, which lets me know where the library exists. I don't want my synced library to live on a network drive, and I don't want it to exist in a local sync folder. So like a third-party sync folder, such as a Dropbox folder, Google Drive, Box. Those are fine for backups of your EndNote libraries, but you don't want to store a library that you're actively developing on a network drive or a local sync folder, and that's doubly true if you're setting up the sync feature. You want that synced library to exist on your local drive within an unsynced folder. So I know here on this Mac, my Documents folder isn't being synced by iCloud, so this is a perfectly acceptable location for me to have my synced library, and it's good for me to double check this before I set it up. So if everything looks good and I'm ready to set up that sync feature, again, here in EndNote 20, I can go to the library drop-down menu. This is a new drop-down menu where we've tried to unify a lot of the commands pertaining to the library window within a single drop-down menu. And I would just go ahead and click on sync. This is no additional cost to set up sync. It's just not configured by default. If I click on sync, I get a login prompt, and if I had not yet created an EndNote Online account, I wouldn't necessarily have to go to myendnoteweb.com from a browser to do so. I could just click sign up here, and I would walk through a similar account creation process. So again, when you're a desktop user, you can create an EndNote Online account either from the website itself or from the sync interface here. I've already got an account. I'm not going to sign up for one. I'm just going to use those same credentials that I had inputted when we logged in from Firefox. So give me just a moment here, make sure I'm typing everything correctly. All right. Now, when I press OK, the first time you set up the sync feature, EndNote will ask if you want to make a backup of your preferred library, whatever library it is that you have open at that time. And, it's not a requirement, but they say, here's my prompt now, they say, if you make a backup, you'll probably never need it. It's when you don't have a backup that something always seems to go wrong. And I really, from my days of product support, or just being a computer user in general, I've gotten bit by that Murphy's Law, a couple of times myself. So it is a good idea to make a backup. Even if you're not syncing, I would regularly back up your library just like you would any other important computer file. But again, the first time you sync, you get a prompt to save a backup. I can save one now if I press yes. I'm going to be taken through to the compressed library creation process. For backup purposes, of course, they say it's best to store your backups on a completely separate drive. That way, if your primary drive crashes or if that device gets stolen or breaks, your important computer files would be backed up elsewhere. For time's sake today, I'm just going to go ahead here in my Documents folder. Actually, I'll go ahead and save this in Dropbox, I guess. Again, backups of your library can be saved in a network folder or a local sync folder like this. So I'm going to leave this default name for this library, this sample library. We see the compressed library file extension here. That's perfectly acceptable. I do, recommend if you do have enough storage space, you can save sequential backups. That way, if there's some sort of problem that wasn't apparent right away, that might exist in your most recent backup as well. If you're saving those sequential backups and maybe appending the numeric date to the file name, you can check your second most recent backup to see if whatever problem has arisen is not present in that second most recent backup to possibly restore from. So with that said, I'm going to just go ahead and complete this process, this backup process, by pressing save. And we'll see here in my library, this is a very basic library. I wanted the sync to finish, the sync process to wrap up very quickly. But you might have noticed that, we're seeing some additional items appear here in my groups panel. We see that, this library started, I believe, with 7 references in the desktop library. We see that it's now up to 17. Again, that's because my web library already contained 10 references. And when you sync, not only does your desktop information go up to EndNote Online, but anything that exists online would come down. The sync is a two-way street. We see that I had a group of references here in EndNote Online as well. That group has come down to my desktop library. I'm going to leave this up and return to Firefox just for a moment because I want to show you if I refresh my account page, which was already open, we'll see, if just sort of take a note here, we'll see that my 7 additional references from the desktop library are going to appear, and my custom groups from my desktop library are also going to appear here. So I'm just going to go ahead and reload this page. Perfect. So we see that basically, like I mentioned, the sync is a two-way street. Anything that was unique in my desktop library has now been made available in the web interface and vice versa. And when things get back to normal, and maybe I'm out and about a little more than I am these days, and maybe I'm at a library away from my computer where I've installed EndNote, but I wanted to access my EndNote library information from any device that has an active internet connection and a web browser, I can navigate to myendnoteweb.com. I would be able to access my web library, and from this interface, I could actually, review the references I've already added. I could view PDFs. I don't think this library has any PDFs just yet, but they would be accessible here. I can add information from the web as well. If I wanted to maybe capture a reference or attach a new PDF, I can do that from the web. Those changes would sync down to my desktop library the next time I was there. And I did want to mention, if you happen to be, an iPhone user or an iPad user, we've got a dedicated EndNote app for iPhone and iPad, which acts as an extension of your synced library. That's a free app to download from the web store or the App Store. And when you install the app on your iPhone or iPad, again, it just acts as an extension of your synced library. Anything that exists in your EndNote Online account would be accessible from the iPhone or the iPad app. And in addition to that, any changes you make on the iPhone or iPad would appear once you've synced on the iPhone or iPad in EndNote Online. And again, if you have a desktop version of EndNote as well, any of those changes would also appear in your desktop library. So sync really gives you a lot of flexibility, really increases your flexibility in regard to where you're working with your references and how you're accessing and sort of managing and building your EndNote library. Now I'm going to go ahead and hide my browser again, minimize it just for another moment, because I wanted to mention what we would do to sync on a second or third computer. And if someone might not have invested some time in a class like this, you might think that once you've synced on your first computer, you would have to take this complete library and open it on your second or third computer where you've also installed EndNote. And that's not really the case. If you want to sync on a second or third computer where you've also installed EndNote, you would start this process with a new blank library. I've only got one Mac with me right now, and so we're going to sort of pretend, or I'm going to set up a scenario, and we'll pretend we're on another computer. But let's say that I have a Mac Mini that we're on right now, where I've installed EndNote and I synced my library to start with. Let's say I also have a MacBook Pro and I installed my same EndNote license on the MacBook, and I want to access my synced library, the information in my synced library on that computer. I'm going to go ahead and close this existing library. We're going to hide everything else temporarily. And again, we're just sort of pretending like we had started on my Mac Mini. Now we're on my MacBook Pro. I've got my EndNote 20 installed here. I might not have any other libraries just yet. To get started with setting up sync on a second or third computer, you would want to make a new blank library. So here, if we pretend we're on my second computer, which is a MacBook Pro, I would be able to, in EndNote, go to the File menu. I can choose New. I can, again, save this library to any local folder that's not being synced by a third-party service. I think just to keep things organized or clear, I'm going to go ahead and, instead of saving this in Documents, I'm going to go ahead and save this to my Home folder here, and we'll just call it Sync Library MacBook. It isn't a requirement that you assign a different name on a secondary device, although it is recommended by our development team. And again, any name is perfectly acceptable as long as you're okay with it. Something pertaining to the device and the fact that it's your sync library might make a lot of sense, but again, whatever your preferred naming convention is, that's fine. But I've got my name set. I've got a location and an unsynced folder on my local hard drive. If I press save, all right, we see a new blank library on my screen. I'm just going to resize it to get a better use of my screen real estate. And so now, if I wanted to sync sort of from scratch on this second or, again, third computer, I would go to the Library drop-down menu, and I would click the sync command. Because I've already inputted my credentials, I'm not going to see that login prompt, but that's what you would see once you've set up sync or when you've tried to set up sync on a secondary device. So again, if on a second or third computer, when you click sync, you would see the login prompt where you would just be able to input your EndNote online credentials. When I click this, it's actually going to just recognize my stored credentials, and it's going to mention that I'm trying to sync a library that's different than the last. That's something you wouldn't see on a secondary installation. We're only going to see that because we're actually on the same computer where I had set up sync initially. So you'll see if I go to library and I choose sync, we get this warning. And this is something that would occur in general. You know, once you've designated a sync library on a particular computer, if you open a different library and try to sync with it, you'll get this warning, which basically says if you proceed, the contents of library A are going to be merged with library B that you currently have open. Now, if that's something you're not looking to do, I would recommend clicking no and sort of taking stock of which library it is that you have open. But in this scenario, that is exactly what I'm looking to do here. There's nothing in this library to merge with the existing references. All that's going to happen, and which is what would happen in general when you sync on a secondary device, the initial sync that you perform, all of the existing reference information will copy down to this new library, and then going forward, once every 15 minutes, EndNote would check to see if it needed to send or receive any new library information. So I'm going to go and say yes just to proceed, and again, we're going to see all of my existing information just stream back down that was stored in my web library. And this is a very small library. It looks like it's already finished. If your library is a bit larger, if you have file attachments and things like that, the initial sync might take a little bit longer than what we're seeing here. But just due to time's sake, I wanted to make sure that this wrapped up very quickly. Now, when you set up the sync feature, you have a heading on the left of your library at the top of the Groups panel in EndNote 20 called Sync Status. This window gives you some details about your sync, something you might never need to come take a look at yourself. But if you're encountering like an incomplete sync, these statistics would let you know. In some cases, you might have a corrupted PDF attached to a library record that can hold up EndNote's syncing. And so if that was occurring, you would see, let's say maybe the local library, they both say 0, but let's say the local library said 2, online library said 0. That would let me know that something's holding up the sync. And these sync status details are really helpful for our EndNote product support team to help try to understand what's going on in terms of your unique sync scenario and what you would want to do to troubleshoot or overcome whatever obstacle it is that's holding up your sync, your ability to sync the whole library. So I did want to mention that. Now, once you've set up, like I mentioned, once you set up EndNote Sync, you have the option to share your synced library with up to 100 other EndNote desktop users. So if you have any co-authors, collaborators, colleagues, research assistants, a professor who might need to see references you're gathering for a project, you can invite those persons to access this library from their EndNote desktop installation. So if I go to with my designated sync library open, which is what's open right now, if I go to the File menu and I about halfway down click Share, I'll have an interface where I can configure who's got access to my synced library. And we can see that I've already got 2 sharees. My colleagues, Steve and Anthony, are both members. They both accepted my sharing invitation. You can see I've given Steve read-only access. He, for our project, just needs to be able to search and cite from my shared library, in which case read-only will allow him to do that. My colleague Anthony, I want him to be able to, add references and annotate PDFs and things like that. And with his read and write access, he would pretty much be able to do almost anything that I would be doing in that library. If I want to invite someone else, I would just define that person's email address excuse me, about halfway down on this window. I'm going to invite my colleague Rick. And like I mentioned, each person can be assigned a varying level of access rights. I can do this ahead of time before I send the invitation. Maybe Rick, I too will want him to be able to build and add references to the library, so I'll give him read and write access. I could, add a personalized note here just to reinforce the that invitation that I was sending to my colleague. Even if you don't send or add a personalized message, the intent of the email is very clear. So don't feel compelled or obliged. Don't feel obliged that you have to add a note. But if you'd like to add a message, you can do so here. When I'm ready, I can press invite, and my newly invited sharees will be pending until they accept my invitation. So you can see Rick, his status is pending until he opens the email that he receives and clicks the accept button, in which case he would have to input his EndNote online login credentials to sort of establish the link between the two accounts, and he would become a member of my sharing team at that point. At any time, even after someone accepts a sharing invitation, you can come to the screen here and you can click the little menu next to the gear displayed next to each one of the sharees. You can remove someone at any point, even if they've accepted the invitation. If someone's no longer a member of your sharing team, you can remove them. That will generate an email alert just to let the person know that they no longer have access to that shared library. If someone was still pending and maybe the invitation email got overlooked, or maybe it got picked up as spam and the person cleared their spam messages, you can choose remind, and that would basically just generate another invitation email that, again, you would be able to send to your newly invited colleague or sharing team member, just so that they can accept that invitation. And at any point, even after someone accepts an invitation, you can change someone's access rights. So let's say my colleague Steve, maybe his role is changing on the team, moving into an expanded role where he will need to be able to modify the contents of the library. I could give him read and write access instead. The changing of the permissions would also generate an alert email just to let the person know that their permissions have either grown or broadened, where they can do more in the library, or if they've become restricted. If they've gone from read and write to read only, an alert email would be sent just to let them know not to expect to be able to do what they did in the library the last time once they open it again. But like I mentioned, you can have up to 100 sharees, technically 101 sharing team members if you include yourself, and you see a little statistic at the bottom just letting you know overall how many sharees you have at that time. I'm going to go and close this interface. I've shown you what it looks like to be the sharer of a library. If someone has shared a library with you, like I mentioned, you'll receive an email. You'll have to click an accept button. Once you've inputted your login credentials, that'll establish the connection. You'll officially be a member of that person's sharing team. And back here in EndNote 20, I would be able to open that shared library by going to the File drop-down menu, where I've got a menu item here, Open Shared Library. I'll click on that. Now, like I mentioned, when you're syncing and sharing with others, you have to pick and choose one particular library that you're using for these actions. But when you're a sharee, you could be members of multiple teams at the same time. So I'm currently just a sharee on one team library. That's why I just have one email address listed here. But if I was collaborating on 5 different projects with 5 different teams of researchers, and I've been invited to 5 different shared libraries, when I came to open shared library in that scenario, I would have 5 different email addresses here. Each entry would show the email of the owner of that particular library, and all it would need to do to interact with a particular library is highlight the owner's email address and then choose open. Now, the first time you open a shared library, it does have to perform that initial sync, just like I did when I mimicked syncing on a second computer. Now, this is the first time I'm syncing the shared library. This library has much more information than my personal library that I have open behind the scenes, so this will just take a moment to finish. But before I resize it, I just want to sort of highlight that, each of these libraries is a separate container. If I accept a library sharing invitation, I can still maintain my own synced library that I'm sharing with other users, but I would have the ability to then, once I've accepted someone else's sharing invitation, I would have the ability to interact with that person's shared library at any point. They're completely separate. You can copy and paste references and their associated file attachments from one library to another. So even if someone only has read-only access in your shared library, they technically could still copy references and paste them into another library. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. They're still completely separate containers here. And it just looks like it's just taking a little bit of time for this to finish. This library does have some file attachments, and so this might take a little bit of time to complete. But let me see if I wanted to show you the activity feed before we move on. Let me just resize this library. I did want to mention, I'm a read and write sharee in this team library here. So I could do pretty much anything that the sharer can do. I can add a reference, I can delete a reference, I can add a group, I can delete a group, I can attach a PDF article, I could annotate that article, and any of the annotations that I make would be synced between all of the other sharing team members. Like I had mentioned, EndNote by default will sync your library once every 15 minutes while it's open to see if it needs to send or receive any new library information. You can always preempt that auto sync. You could go to the library drop-down menu. This is grayed out because it's still actively syncing, but for you, if you were between syncs, this would be clickable, and if you wanted to get a sort of more real-time changes, then once every 15 minutes, you can click this menu item at any point, and again, EndNote, that would make EndNote look to see if it needed to send or receive any library information. Looks like the sync is just about wrapping up here. What I wanted to show you was back under sync status, and looks like I do have to wait for this to refresh before I can show you the activity feed, but it looks like it's just about done here. We see we've got quite a few additional groups and file attachments compared to that real basic library that I started with. But in just a moment, this should be all done. And again, the activity feed gives me an audit trail so that, if someone made a change to the library, I would be able to take a look at the activity feed, and I would be able to see who made the change. Oh, it looks like it just finished. I'd be able to see who made the change. I would be able to see when that change was made. So what we would want to do for the activity feed, we see this little icon here that's right next to sync status, sort of an abstract icon. It's a silhouette of a person and a bell. But if I click on that, that takes me to the activity feed here. And again, I can see from this window 500 of the most recent changes made to the shared library. Now you're seeing some sort of generic labels like EndNote training and default user. That's just because these are, this is a library that is used for various classes, various training videos that we've created, and so we don't always want to show someone's name for those resources. But for you, each one of these entries would be the name of a person on your sharing team. And any of these bolded entries I could click on and see those changes that were impacted by that particular change. So if I scroll down a bit, we see my colleague Dan. He had added 9 attachments to this library, and if I wanted to see which references were part of the changes that Dan had created, I can click on this entry, and then EndNote right away shows me on the library window which references were related to that change. So this is, again, a great sort of audit trail when you have a sharing team to know, to understand if someone's made a change, when the change was made, and who made the change. The one thing you can't do from the activity feed is you can't undo a change. So that's why I'm saying, even if you're not sharing your library, it's important to back up your library on a regular basis. If you are sharing your library, excuse me, it's doubly important because someone else might make an unintended change that propagates to the rest of the sharing team. And if that change isn't spotted right away, let's say someone deleted a reference and by mistake, if that change isn't spotted right away, it could possibly disappear from everyone's library. At that point, you can always manually add something back, but if you've got regular backups of your library, that might save you from having to recreate any work due to an unintended change. So again, it's a good idea to, especially if you're sharing your library, to back it up on a regular basis. Now, like I had mentioned, when you're sharing a library, your sharees have access to everything. They can see all of your groups, they can see all of your references, and all of your file attachments. In some cases, you might only need to share part of your library with someone for maybe a particular group. So not only can I share a library, with other EndNote users, but I can share individual custom groups from my synced library here in EndNote 20. Now, the library we're currently looking at is the library that I'm a sharee on. And even if you have read and write access on a team shared library, as a read and write sharee, I can't add someone to the sharing team for that person's library, and I can't remove someone from that sharing team. So again, I as a sharee, I can't share these individual custom groups. If I want to share a group, I have to go back to my library that I'm syncing with EndNote Online. So I'm going to close this shared library. I could click the little red button in the top left. I can go to File and choose Close Library. Either way, I think I'll use the menu item today. Now I'm back in my synced library. This is a library that, I synced with EndNote Online. I'm sharing with some other users. And again, if maybe I've got a colleague who only needs access to one of my groups for a particular project that we're working on, instead of going to File and choosing Share to share the entire library with that person, I could select a custom group here in EndNote 20, the custom group icon. It looks like this inbox, and really it's just letting you know that, a custom group is the type of group that you have to manually populate. So again, here in EndNote 20, any of these groups with the inbox icon I can share with other EndNote users. Let's say that I want to share my treatment group. Well, actually, let's say I'm going to share my to-sort group for the asthma project with my colleague Colin. I can, once I've got that group highlighted, I can right-click on it. Either, if you've got a Mac trackpad, it's a two-finger click. You can always hold down Control as you just do a single finger click as well. That would bring up the contextual menu. But here on the menu, I've got the option to share group. I'm going to choose that. And I get a similar interface. I get a window where I can define the EndNote users that I want to grant access to this particular shared group. Now, this process isn't going to generate a sharing invitation that the person has to accept. When you share a group from EndNote 20, it will generate an alert email to let the person know you've shared a group with them. But there's nothing they need to accept when you share a group. So again, if I want to give my colleague Colin access to this particular group, I would just define that person's email address here. Just like library sharing, I can give a group sharee read-only access, or I could give them read and write access. Either way, I think I'll go ahead and give my colleague Colin read and write access. I could add a personalized note to that email, but again, it's pretty apparent what the alert email is intended to convey, even if you don't add a personalized note. I'll finish this process by pressing Invite, and we see that my sharee shows up here at the top of the group sharing window, and we see that there's nothing about their status, because again, they don't need to accept my group sharing invitation. It just is going to show up for them automatically in EndNote Online. I did want to point out, again, just like library sharing, I could remove a group sharee at any point by clicking the little gear next to their name. This doesn't really come into play as much for group sharing, but if I did want to send a person a secondary alert email to let them know that I've shared a group, I could do that by choosing Remind, and at any point I can modify a group sharee's access rights to either restrict or broaden their abilities in my group of references. I'll go ahead and leave Colin to read and write. When I'm done, I'll press Close. Now, library sharing takes place in EndNote Desktop, and again, if you want to share a library, you go to File, Share. If you want to open someone else's shared library, you would go to File, Open Shared Library. Group sharing actually takes place via EndNote Online. So you can see here in EndNote 20, if anyone is sharing a group with you within your designated sync library, you would see under a heading called Group Shared by Others, you would see those particular instances. You can see that I'm a sharee on one shared group. This is the email address of the sharer. This is the group name here. And this shortcut, again, I'm not going to be able to look at or modify the contents of this group from EndNote 20, but with this shortcut, I can click on it. It'll take me to my default browser where I can access this particular group in my EndNote Online library. So you can see here, even though we've been using Firefox for the other web browsing, on this Mac, Safari is my default browser, so that's come up here. And in my web library interface, here in my Groups panel, I have a heading called Group Shared by Others, where I see any of the groups that are being shared with me. Because I clicked the shortcut from EndNote 20, it's taking me right to the shared group. This icon, this is, again, sort of an abstract abstract icon. It looks like the silhouette of two persons and a pencil. That's letting me know that I have read and write access to this particular shared group. So that means I could open these individual references, and not only can I look at the metadata here that might not be displayed on the primary library window, but with read and write access, I can make changes to these references. I can add additional references to this group if I want. None of these references actually exist in my library. These 49 references actually exist in someone else's library. I've just been granted access to this library. You can have, like I mentioned, with library sharing, you can have up to 100 sharees on your designated sync library. Group sharing, you can actually have up to 1,000 sharees on each of your custom groups. But again, the key thing is with group sharing that your sharee has to have an EndNote online account like this, and they would have to interact with it from the web interface. The other major difference between library sharing and group sharing is that group sharees cannot see your file attachments. So in this REM sleep group that someone else has invited me to, they might have PDF articles for each one of these entries here, but as a group sharee, I can't see those attachments. If file attachments are critical for your sharing needs or your project that you're working on, library sharing is the way to go for that, because with library sharing, the sharees can access file attachments. Just to reiterate, when you're sharing a group, your group sharees cannot see your file attachments. So in some cases, that might dictate, which of the two solutions you might use for a particular project. So I just wanted to point out those primary differences. So that's basically a quick overview of the EndNote sync feature in EndNote 20 here. Like I had mentioned, you have to pick a specific library that you're syncing and sharing. When you want to set up the sync feature here in EndNote 20, you go to the library menu and you choose sync. If you want to then share that library, you go to file and share. If someone has accepted, if someone has sent you an invitation that you've accepted, you can open someone else's shared library from the file menu by choosing Open Shared Library. Group sharing, of course, takes place at EndNote Online. You would go to myendnoteweb.com from a browser for that. Shifting gears, I just want to check the chat here. Okay, no chat questions just yet, but again, as we proceed through the class, if any questions come up, feel free to just post that right in the primary chat window, and we will circle back around at the end of the session to get those questions answered. But we're going to go ahead and shift gears here. We're going to transition into our learning objectives related to EndNote content files. And again, we've got in EndNote a team of content file experts that develop things like output styles to ensure that EndNote is formatting references according to a publisher's guidelines, or the formatted guidelines pertain to like a standardized formatting guidelines like a APA or MLA, things like that. But there's also a content file called a connection file, and that's what I was mentioning, allows EndNote to connect to a remote database to search that database for reference materials to add to your library. Here in EndNote 20, I'm going to go ahead and collapse my groups temporarily to make my online search section a little bit more visible. So again, in EndNote 20, if you want to temporarily collapse your group structure, the overarching My Groups label, if you click the little arrow next to it, that'll temporarily collapse that group structure. We see that there are a couple of other labels here in the groups panel that, if you're performing a findable text search, the outcome of that search would show up here. Like I had mentioned, this group shared by others would show any groups that are being shared with you via EndNote Online. And at the bottom, we see online search. This is the feature that allows EndNote to connect to a remote database from the EndNote application. These shortcuts are what we call your favorites. There are a handful of connection files that are marked by default as favorite. You can always reconfigure what shows up as a favorite connection file, or really any type of favorite content file here from the Tools dropdown. If you want to reconfigure your favorite output styles, you can do that by opening the Style Manager here. Same goes for import filters, and again, same goes for connection files. Now, like I had mentioned, when you're using this online search feature, the remote database has to support a specific database protocol called Z39.50. It's a data protocol that was developed for bibliographic databases in the late 80s. Library of Congress is the current custodian of that protocol. And most of these connection files here that are labeled as library catalog, those are digitized card catalogs at schools around the world. Those are typically free to search, although a database administrator can lock down an institution's Z39.50 database if for whatever reason they only want their students and faculty to be able to query that resource. That's something that can be done, but the overwhelming majority of these library catalogs are free to search. There are, I did want to mention, some nationally and federally funded databases listed here that are free to search. A Library of Congress is really the quintessential free books database if you're looking for a book reference. Good chance it's indexed by Library of Congress. PubMed is the sort of premier, medical research database. It's federally funded here in the States. Almost anyone in the world can access that and query for resources to add to your library. But like I mentioned, in some cases, the remote database, the database administrator may change either some of the technology that's being used, which will impact some of the connection settings, or they'll just change the connection settings for some other reason. And if that were to occur, typically, unless they contact us to let us know, we only find out when someone comes across a connection file that no longer connects. So ahead of the session, I've found a connection file that actually appears to be outdated that we'll use as an example today. So the University of Texas at Austin, that's going to be our example. I've marked it as a favorite just so that it's easily accessible here. Not a requirement. You could always press more and choose a connection file from the complete list, but I did just want to show you how you can reconfigure your favorites here. I'm going to close this now that I've shown you that we've marked it as a favorite. And back on my library window, I can try to establish a connection with this remote database by just clicking on its name here. So when you choose a connection file, if there is a connection issue, in some cases it might take up to 2 minutes before the connection times out, but something related to the connection settings themselves, the error message will usually come up right away. So we can see that as soon as I clicked on utexas-austin, we got a domain name error message. And this, typically would let you know that there's some sort of connection issue with that database. In some cases, it might actually be that the database administrator or the database host took that database down either temporarily or permanently. This isn't a requirement that someone has to host one of these Z39.50 compliant databases, although they are still very popular these days. But again, it might just be that a temporary connection issue related to changes made to the connection settings. And so today I want to show you how you can possibly find updated connection settings and apply those to a connection file. So I'm going to click OK. And we're going to go back to the Tools drop-down menu again. Oops, excuse me, I clicked on the wrong menu item. So back on the Tools drop-down, I'll once more point my mouse over Open Connection Files. I could choose Open Connection Manager, but because I've already tried to establish a connection, my Edit shortcut is directly to my utexas-austin connection file. Ultimately, that's where I want to get, and so I'm just going to go ahead and click on this Edit shortcut. I'm now on what we call the Edit Connection window, where all of the connection settings and definitions for this remote database are stored. Now, if you're familiar with import filters, a lot of these settings are similar to what you would see in an import filter in EndNote, but the connection file as we see here, has an additional section for connection settings. And so you'll see there are details like a server address, which is pretty much, the URL on the web where EndNote will try to query this remote database. We see the database has a specific database name. There's a particular port that these databases communicate over. EndNote doesn't have any control over what port is being used. That's defined by the database administrator. Again, if any of these bits of information have been changed, it may cause the connection file in EndNote to no longer be able to connect. Now, if you were at this institution, if you were a student, let's say at University of Texas at Austin, you might want to reach out to your library, and you can ask your librarian, or you basically say, I'm trying to use the EndNote connection file for our card catalog. It's not working. Is this database still active? And if so, what are the connection settings? But in some cases, you might actually be able to find the information on the web yourself. So, when I'm going to do like a Google search for these details, I could query the name of the institution, perhaps, and other phrases, but I think a good first step for trying to find updated information would be to try to query the server address. So you might have noticed I just highlighted the server address. I performed a Command-C keyboard shortcut to copy that. I'm going to leave this window open, but I'm going to return to Firefox. Now, I did want to point out there are sites on the web that sort of index these connection settings. One popular site here is called z-brary.com. This is a directory of z39.50 and SRU targets. I'm going to put this link in the chat just in case anyone is curious. All right. And once you've gone, if you're curious of coming to this page, once you've visited this page, you could try to look for that particular institution. And now I believe the University of Texas connection settings here aren't actually part of this index. So if you visit zBrary and you can't find your particular database in question, you might just go to a Google search page. And again, you can query different bits of information, but usually I would try querying the existing server address and perhaps the protocol name z39.50 in quotation marks. And I've already initiated that search here, and we can see that the top hit is a libguide at the University of Texas, and I've already got that open in another tab. And we see that at the University of Texas Libraries. They've got a page dedicated to various EndNote tips and tricks, and if we scroll down, they're actually gracious enough to include the z39.50 connection settings for their database here. Again, this isn't a requirement. Not every institution is going to do this, but this does greatly facilitate questions or issues like this, because again, we might not need to involve a librarian or the EndNote product support team for something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and just try to replace or verify some of these connection settings in my existing connection file to see if we update those settings, if we could establish a connection. So I'm going to go and just copy the server address. Command-C, go back to EndNote. I'm going to go and paste over the old server address. We see that port 210 was previously defined, and if I look here, it looks like they're using two different ports. Port 210 is one of them. So I'm just going to go and, leave that defined. The database name appears to be different, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight that, copy it, go back over to EndNote, replace the previous database name with this updated name. I'm going to pretty much leave everything else as is here. I don't think I'm going to need to tweak anything else. Now, I did notice, if we look back at the connection file, it mentions these connection settings, mention the particular fields that are searchable. And, if I want to go back to my connection file here, my search attributes basically is a list of all of those particular entries. Now, a lot of these connection settings, you don't even, this is sort of the expert level lesson plan for EndNote, but a lot of these connection settings, you have to be a Z39.50 expert. So we're not going to really talk about tags too much or things like that. We're really just focusing on connection settings today. But like I wanted to point out, it looks like one of the field options here, author/title/subject, that does not seem to be a searchable identifier or attribute any longer. So that might be an instance where I want to take this off, just delete these particular fields on this window here, because if the remote database doesn't support that search attribute any longer, even if it's defined in my connection file, it's not going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out here as well. Whenever I'm ready, I can go to the File menu. I can choose Save As, because I'm going to want to keep the base connection file just in case. This really applies to any content file. If you're editing an existing style, filter, or connection file, EndNote's going to ask that you save your modified version with the new names just to ensure that you keep the base content file if you were ever going to want to revert back to it. So I could call this, I can call this Texas-Austin copy if I wanted to. Maybe I'll take the word copy off. Maybe I'll replace it with updated just to make it a little bit clearer as to what this particular connection file, its purpose is. If I go ahead and press Save, I can now close my Edit Connection window, and we see that my updated connection file has already been marked as a favorite, and it's listed as a shortcut right here on the within the Groups panel. So I can click on its name. All right, you might have noticed we did not get an error message immediately, which is a good sign. You might also have noticed that the default field selection here has changed, because previously it was the multi-parameter option of author your title, I believe it was, and now, again, because that remote database doesn't support it, you've got the individual parameters here to choose. So I'll go ahead and maybe we'll just leave author selected, and I'm going to search for a very common surname of Johnson just to see, if anything is found in this database. So now that I've got my basic search crafted, if I press search, we should see if it's successful and if it's the connection was successfully established and there's any matching references in that database. Perfect. We're seeing references start to stream in here. And with EndNote 20, when you perform an online search, EndNote will automatically receive the first 25 search results. And if there happen to be additional search results beyond 25, you would have the ability to download 50, 100, 500, or the complete range if you wanted to of 19, in this case, 19,000 references. So again, just a quick overview of what we just took a look at. We found an outdated connection file in EndNote where the database administrator hasn't reached out to us to let us know that their connection settings have changed. But with some details that were stored, in the connection file and just knowing the name of the institution, you can typically do a pretty simple Google search, possibly find updated connection settings out on the web to try to, update your existing connection file to establish a connection with that remote database again. So that, something you probably won't do on a day-to-day basis, but I would definitely consider that workflow to be, expert level, function or feature, in the EndNote application itself. Still talking about still talking about content files, I wanted to talk a little bit about output styles next. I had mentioned I was going to show you how to download a new output style from our website. So if I'm going to leave my library open. If I go back to Firefox, I believe I've already got, yes, I've already got here on EndNote.com. I've already navigated to our downloads page. You see, and I'm going to go and put a link to this in the chat as well, just in case. But you can see that our downloads page is just EndNote.com/downloads. Just to show you where it's found on the home page itself, if I return to just EndNote.com, we've redesigned our page for the launch of EndNote 20. The downloads page, you have to scroll down a little bit to access, but you see about 2/3 of the way down, we've got a tab for downloads. I can click on that. The various resources are accessible from the downloads page, but primarily this is where all of our content file repositories are found. So not only, like I mentioned, output styles, but there are additional import filters that are available to download. There are additional connection files that are available to download as well. We're going to be focusing on output styles for this learning objective. So I'm going to click Add Output Styles. That takes us to our style repository, where again we've just crossed the we've actually crossed the 7,000 style threshold. This is actually an outdated number here, but we've got 7,106 styles at this point. And so you'll see that for the table of styles, the default sort order is just the date that it was posted. So the most recent styles are listed at the top of the table. I can click on any of these column labels to temporarily resort the table by that particular piece of information. Above the table, you might have noticed I had some search options. If I wanted to search for a publication name or the name of a set of common formatting guidelines, I can search for that here. If I didn't have a particular publication in mind, maybe just a sort of a general format for the references I was looking for, I can do a search by citation style perhaps to try to find styles that match that citation format requirement, and I can then edit the style further. Or perhaps a publisher. Maybe there's a journal that we don't have an existing style for, but maybe we have a style from another journal from a publisher. In some cases, publishers will use a very similar formatting requirement for their various publications, in which case you might be able to make some minor tweaks to a different style from a publisher to get it to match the formatting guidelines of the journal you're interested in. Today, I'm not going to do a search. We're just going to go and download one of these topmost entries here. But just know, once you've come to our online style repository, once you've identified a style that you're interested in, you would just click the download link next to that entry. And initially, it doesn't matter where it downloads to. Here in Firefox, I get the prompt to either open or save the file. I want to be sure I save it. Chrome and Safari are just going to save the file automatically. That's perfectly fine. Once the file has been downloaded, these are very tiny files, wherever it's downloaded, you would just open it. So even if it's just in your downloads folder like it is here, if I just open this item on my downloads list, we see I'm now taken back to EndNote, and I'm on a window that looks similar to that edit connection window, but I'm now on what we would refer to as the edit style window. This is where all of the settings related to this particular output style are set up and defined. I wouldn't need to make any further changes here. I would just need to save this in my EndNote installation. So with this window showing, if I want to go to the File drop-down menu here at the top of the screen, I can choose Save As. I can give this style any name I'd like, and since this style does not yet exist for me, I can save it with that default name. But if maybe I had an existing version that just had become outdated, maybe I could append the word, updated at the end. Really doesn't matter. It's just as long as you know what the name is, any naming convention is perfectly acceptable. I'll go ahead and just leave this, International J Surgical Pathology. I'll leave that as is. I'll press Save. That's all I have to do. I can now close this window. I could either click the red button in the top left, or I can go to the File dropdown and choose Close Style, either way. And just to confirm that that style is now available in my EndNote application here in EndNote, I can go back to Tools. This time I'll point my mouse over Output Styles, and then I'll choose Open Style Manager. And this style manager looks very similar to that connection manager window that we looked at, but these are all of the output styles that I have available here in EndNote. Typically, this list is sorted by default alphabetically by the style name. So I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down this list here. If I did want to change, any of my favorited styles, I would just put a check in their box. We see here we've got my style that I just downloaded. So if I want to mark this as a favorite so that it's easily selectable in Word, now that it's checked, I would be able to do so, and the style is now part of a short list of my favorite styles so that I don't have to select it from this complete list each and every time. So that is pretty much as simple as that. Like I mentioned, you might find a style on a third-party website, sometimes a publisher on their instructions for authors page. They might have developed their own custom style, and they can share that with us, and after some QA, we can put it here in our style repository. But if they'd like, the publisher can just host that file themselves, and it's the same process. Wherever you come across a style, that's going to be downloaded somewhere on your drive, and if you open it with EndNote and perform a Save As, that's how you would incorporate it in your EndNote application. I did just want to point out where this style file ends up once you've saved it. I've opened up a Finder window here so that I can look at the contents of my hard drive on this Mac. Here in Documents, we see that I've got an EndNote subfolder, and that didn't exist at the start of the class here. Whenever you modify a content file or save a new content file within EndNote, it's going to be saved within this EndNote folder. So we see that, that connection file that I had updated. We see that a subfolder called Connections was created here. We see that my style that I just saved, we see that it's in a style subfolder here. So I did just want to point out where these files end up being saved on your drive. Now, if I wanted to, I could download another style file back on my website, back on our website here. If I save that and return to that Finder window, if I wanted to at this point, I can go to Downloads. I can select the style I just downloaded. I can cut or copy it, perhaps. I can go back to Documents. I can in Documents, go to the EndNote subfolder, open the Styles folder there. I can paste it, and that style, that would make the style available in my EndNote application. That's a little bit more expert level, so I'd say definitely the easiest method of saving a new content file in EndNote is just opening it and performing the Save As in the EndNote application like we just walked through. But I did want to point out that once you've got this EndNote folder created, and you've got the appropriate subfolders for those types of content files, if you wanted to just drag and drop something into one of these folders, that too would also add it to your EndNote installation so that you would be able to select it in your EndNote application going forward. Still talking about content files, I wanted to discuss import filters here just for a moment. The import filter is the content file that EndNote uses to know how to import data, how to read data that you're importing into EndNote, and then how to import the data into your EndNote library records. So here on my desktop, I've got a file that I've saved in the past from PubMed. This is again from a PubMed search that I had performed a little bit earlier this year. They still use the same format. This is what PubMed calls their Medline format. This is a consistently tagged format where each piece of data is on its own line with an identifying tag in front of it. And when you're importing data into EndNote, it's really not reading the reference information. It's expecting the data to be in a tagged format like this. And then based on the tags that are in use in your text file and the filter that you apply to the import action, EndNote would know which set of tags to look for, and in the filter itself, EndNote would have an associated field in your EndNote library where that data should be imported. So we see here from PubMed in their Medline tagging system, PMID is typically the PubMed identifier, and that usually goes into the session number field. OWN is sort of the database provider, and there's a database field in your EndNote library. Reading, TI is the title, AB is the abstract. And just to show you, if I can reposition this maybe so this is taking up about half the screen, I can go back into my EndNote application. And I'm going to go ahead and just minimize my library just for a moment. I'm going to go here in EndNote back to Tools. This time I'm going to point my mouse over Import Filters, and I'm going to choose Open Filter Manager. First time we've taken a look at this screen. Just like the Style Manager and Connection Manager, this is listing all of the import filters available in your EndNote application. There are more available to download from the web. But let's say I wanted to actually modify how EndNote is importing data coming from PubMed. I've got a list of filters here, and in some cases there might be the same database listed multiple times, just hosted by different database providers, because in some cases, more than one information provider might host a particular database. But I know just, based on my experience with EndNote, that the PubMed filter here on this list is called PubMed NLM, and to modify this filter, I could either double-click on it here, or I can single-click and press Edit, either way. But now I'm on the Edit Filter window, which again looks very similar to the Edit Connection window and Edit Style window, but these are all of the settings related to an import filter. And specifically what we were talking about today is modifying or altering where a particular piece of information ends up in my EndNote library. So let's say if I just look at this data, that's being imported, let's say I wanted to have, let's use maybe the PMID. Let's say instead of going into a session number, I want the PMID to go into one of my custom fields for whatever reason. I can achieve that here. So again, I know that the tag I want to look for is PMID dash. On this list of tags, I would just scroll down. They're listed alphabetically. I'm looking at the tags currently for journal articles. In some cases, an information provider might index other types of references, and each reference type might have their own tags. I believe PubMed just indexes journal articles. So this, I believe, is the only reference type that's defined here. But again, going down, we see here it is, PMID dash. So EndNote knows every time I see this in your text file, you want the trailing data to go into the session number field. That's usually the case. That is usually where you want the PMID to end up. But let's say for whatever reason I want that to go elsewhere. I can delete the associated field. And then I could manually type in the field name as long as I type it in exactly right. I can also select it from a list of fields by pressing Insert Field. I can really send this anywhere in my EndNote library. But let's say maybe, on this list of fields, maybe I want this to come into, just as an example here, let's maybe choose, I want to use an unused field. So maybe let's go ahead and use label for this purpose here. I'm going to go ahead and select label. And again, when I import this, instead of going to a session number, the PMID should end up in the label field. Now that I've made this change again, I can't save the default PubMed filter. I can't save over the top of it. If I go to the File dropdown, I'm going to need to perform a Save As. I can give this filter, this copy of the filter, any name I'd like. You can see EndNote suggests appending the word copy to the end of the existing name. That's fine, but something a little bit more descriptive might make a little bit of sense. So maybe I might call it PubMed NLM label, just to let myself know that this is the version of the filter where I've modified the label field, what's going in there. If I'm done, I can press Save. Perfect. And so now I can close my filter editor here just by clicking the little red circle in the top left. And just to keep things a little bit organized and make it a little bit clearer as to our outcome, I'm going to create a new blank library for this import. So to do that in EndNote, just go to the File menu. You'll select the menu item for New. Again, you want to save libraries that you're actively developing somewhere on your local drive in an unsynced folder. Just for ease of access, I'm going to go save this library right on my desktop just so that it's easy to remove once we're done. The default name EndNote suggests when you're creating a library is my EndNote library. That's perfectly fine. Something a little bit more descriptive might make some sense. So I'm going to call this call this library PubMed import just to make it clear what its purpose is. Once I've got my location and my name set, I can press save. All right, we see my new blank library appear on my screen. And just to walk you through the import process, for this. And again, this is basically the filter that you're going to be applying to the import. And we just saved a newly named version of that PubMed filter. So I'm going to want to go to for import options, I'm going to want to choose other filters. On my filter manager again, it's asking me to choose a filter. Because I had just worked with this filter, it sort of jumped me right on the list of that particular entry. If not, I might have to scroll through, but I could select this filter by double-clicking on it or just single-clicking to highlight and pressing choose, either way. When you're importing a text file, if EndNote did spot any duplicates in that text file to references that might already exist in your library, instead of importing them, you can just have EndNote discard them automatically, or you might import the duplicates into a completely separate library so that you have them, but they're just in a separate container for safekeeping just in case. This is a blank library, no duplicates here, so I'm going to leave duplicates at the import all. And text translation is almost always no translation. I guess it really depends on, the language of the references, maybe the region you're in, and the language of the research materials that you're indexing in your EndNote library. So certain, double byte Unicode character sets, you might have to come to text translation and choose the appropriate character set for the information in that file. But typically for English language research, text translation is pretty much always set to no translation. When you're ready and you've configured those settings, if you press import, again, EndNote just looks at that text file. It goes reference by reference, line by line, essentially reading the information, reading the tags in front of each piece of information, and then when it finds a tag that's defined in the filter, it looks at the filter to know where that data needs to end up. And I should be able to click on any one of these entries here, and again, in EndNote 20, one of the redesign change that we've implemented is that if you want to look at all of the underlying information for a reference or modify it further, here on the tabs panel, you just go to the Edit tab, and this is all of the information for this highlighted entry here in my reference panel. I could make changes here if I want, but ultimately what I want to see is just that if in label, perfect. We see that this is the what is considered the PMID. It's a unique PubMed identifier. It typically goes to a session number, and I would usually recommend leaving that as is. This was just an example of a change that you might want to make. But we see that instead of those identifiers going to a session number like they normally would, with my customized filter, I've told EndNote to take that information and import it into the label field instead. So that's something, that specific set of circumstances or that scenario might not be something you want to do, but again, anytime you want to just alter, where data is ending up in EndNote after importing a text file, you can achieve that by modifying the templates within the import filter that you select. And just checking time, looks like we've got about 10 minutes left, which is perfect timing because we've got one learning objective left, and I'll be glad to answer any questions in the chat after that. So again, if any questions come up, feel free to put that in the chat. But the last element or item that I wanted to discuss today is one of EndNote's global edit features called Change, Move, Copy Fields. To do this, I want to close this library that I created for the PubMed import. So I'm just going to close it by clicking its red button in the top left. I'll close the text file as well. And maybe I'll actually trash this library just to keep things organized on my drive. Perfect. I've got my original library open that I'm syncing with EndNote Online. It was just minimized, so I'll bring it back to the front of the screen here. And in this library, again, I want to make a global edit. And the scenario that I had described for this learning objective is that in some cases, a user, a researcher might have print materials for some of the digitized information stored in their EndNote library. And you might want to make a filing system for that information. And this recommendation isn't a requirement, but this is something that I've suggested to a lot of users, and other users have come across themselves. But for a jump start for that filing system, what you can do is utilize the automatically assigned EndNote record number as that filing number that you would use for your filing system, because EndNote is assigning these numbers automatically and just save you a little bit of legwork. Now, when you start an EndNote library, EndNote starts assigning record numbers with record number 1, and EndNote will continuously assign the next available number sequentially as you continue to build your library. So, if you add 10 references to your library, you're using record numbers 1 through 10. If you delete those 10 references and that library is temporarily empty, the next reference you add wouldn't be record number 1 again. It would be record number 11. Record numbers are never reused in an EndNote library. So I did want to mention that. If you do choose to use the record number for a filing system, you might end up with gaps in your numbering that isn't problematic per se. It might, if you're a little OCD, it might bug you. So that if that's the case, maybe this wouldn't be a great solution for you. But it shouldn't cause any inherent problems for a filing system per se. But let's say I want to take, if I click on any one of these references here, maybe and take a look at the the edit details, we see that this reference in my library from the first author with the surname Brandt, we see that this is actually record number 15 in my EndNote library. And perhaps I want to, maybe I've got the print article for this particular reference, and I want to just file this away in a filing cabinet and use that as the identifier, how I'm going to find it again in that filing system. What I can do, if I close this tabs panel just for a moment, I can perform a global edit and copy those record numbers to a static field. And I would want to do that because if I synced my library from one computer to another, the record numbers are unique in each copy of that synced library. So again, we're pretending that I'm on my MacBook now, and even though this computer has the same information as would be on that Mac Mini that I described when we first started, because again, each EndNote library has sort of a differing numbering system starting with number 1, there might be differences in that record number assignment. And if I copy my record number to a static field like label, let's say, which typically goes unused, that identifier would be uniform between any of my synced libraries. And again, I could use that for purpose of filing, let's say. So I would, before performing a global edit in EndNote, it's a good idea to back up your library because there's no undo command for a global edit in EndNote. So again, if you haven't made a recent backup in EndNote with your library open, you can go to File, you can choose Compressed Library, or you can choose Save a Copy. Either way, they would both make a snapshot backup of your library. Just this would be a single file in a compressed format. Save a Copy would make a new ENL file and a new data folder for that backup. But again, either one would be a perfectly acceptable solution for backing up the library. Due to time's sake, I'm not going to make another backup. This is just a test library. But when I'm ready to proceed, I want to make sure that I'm displaying the references that I want to include in my global edit action. So if I expand my groups again, if I started my global edit on this treatment group instead, any global edit that I make would only apply to these 2 references. And if I want my global edit to consider the complete contents of this library, in this case, I would want to be on the All References group. Once I've displayed the references that I want to, modify, I could now, here in EndNote 20, go to the Library drop-down menu. Toward the bottom is where I have Change, Move, Copy Field. So I'm going to click on that. So on this window, like I mentioned, you might have, like maybe you've downloaded 10 references from PubMed or another online database, and you want to assign your own keyword to these references so that you can quickly locate these entries down the road. That might be an instance on this interface where you keep change fields selected, and perhaps you might, like I mentioned, in the keywords field, you might add your, a keyword, maybe import, something like that, and you would sort of, depending on what was already in that field, you would choose the appropriate radio button for where you want this new information to be added in relation to existing field data. Alternately, instead of actually changing or adding like a keyword, if you just want to change the casing of information stored in a particular EndNote library record field, you could actually choose change case instead, and you see you've got sentence case, lowercase, uppercase. You can capitalize each word, or you can do the toggle case option here. You can even clear a field. If you didn't want to add a keyword, if you just want to wipe a field out, you can choose that here as well. Today, like I mentioned, we're going to be copying data from one field to another. So we're actually interested in this other tab, Move/Copy Fields. If I wanted to move data from one field to another, of course, that's what move or when move field would come into play. So like, maybe I imported PubMed reference information without doing my custom filter, and my PMIDs ended up in a session number, and ultimately I wanted them in label instead. Rather than redoing the import, I could come to this move field option, and I can tell EndNote in my library, move all of the information from my accession number field and put it in my label field. And that actually would achieve the same outcome. Instead of us modifying the filter after the fact, we could actually come here and perform a global edit and achieve the same outcome. Today, we're actually copying information. So I'm going to choose the radio button next to copy field. And then the from option, we need to choose the source field, and that's record number here. And again, I just need to choose the destination for this. And there are quite a few unused fields in EndNote, but again, label is typically a field that goes unused, and I think this would be perfectly acceptable for this suggestion here for setting up a filing system. Now, because the label field is already empty, I know in this library, it really doesn't matter where I'm placing this information that I'm copying. If there was information that was already present, I could replace that existing information with just the data I'm copying. I could input this information before existing field text or after. Again, because this field is empty, it doesn't really matter what I choose here. I'm going to go ahead and leave the default of insert after field text selected. Whenever I'm ready, I can press import, and I get a confirmation window that says in so many references showing, which is currently 17 for me, that you get a descriptor in my scenario, and it's asking, you want me to copy the record number field to the end of the label field? And then you get a warning that says this operation can't be undone, and it's recommended that you back up the library just in case. Don't need to make a backup. I'm going to go ahead and proceed by pressing OK. This change should take place very quickly. Looks like we've already got the confirmation. If I click OK here, I could open my individual reference to look at that information, but instead I actually want to add label as a display column here, just so that I can easily see this, which is helpful, again, if you are looking to do this to create a filing system for yourself. So I could either, to modify my display fields, I can either go to the EndNote 20 dropdown here on macOS and choose Preferences, in which case I've got a tab called Display Fields, and I've got up to 10 display columns that I can configure as I'd like. So here, let's say maybe I'm going to go ahead and as a field 7, or column 7 rather, on the list of fields that I have available, I'm going to go and find label. And even though this field is known as label, that's the default name, if I'm using this for a filing number, maybe I'll change my heading so that the column, instead of just saying label with that generic field name, I've actually labeled it as filing number, which is my intended use for it. So once I've made this change, I can press save, and I can return to my library window by closing Preferences. I did want to point out, before we actually look at this information, instead of going to Preferences, if I just wanted to add or remove a display column, I can right-click on any one of the display columns here, and I've got a list of fields that I can choose. This wouldn't let me change the heading. I have to do the heading change from Preferences. But again, if you just quickly wanted to add or remove a display field, you can actually, again, just right-click on any one of the display columns, and you've got this contextual menu of different fields. We've already added it, so I don't need to change anything here. I just need to resize some of my fields so that I can actually see these identifiers. There we go. So here's my filing number column, which is actually the label field, and we see that EndNote has assigned using the record number, and I can actually just confirm that with you here. If I just shrink these other fields down, using the record number for each one of these references, EndNote has added this information to the label field for me, and for my purposes, I'm going to use it as a filing system for any print materials that I have. Now, excuse me, I did want to point out that, going forward, as I add references, EndNote isn't going to automatically add the record number to the label field. So I will periodically need to perform future global edits. If I add 10 more references and I want the label information to be added, I would have to perform another, change move copy fields command. And that might be an instance where I still show everything, and instead of just displaying the new references, maybe I'll still show everything, and I go back to library, change move copy fields. Again, in this scenario, I go to move/copy fields. I would be basically just performing the same action again. Excuse me, actually, I'm going to be choosing from record number to label. But on a secondary round, on a secondary instance of this global edit, this might be where I choose replace entire field. That way, if I'm showing a reference where I've already got the record number added to the label field, I would basically just be overwriting the old record number information with the same information again, but this would also allow me to add for references where nothing is in label. I would be able to add those record numbers for those new references that I add. So this is just one scenario, one example of when this change move copy fields command can be beneficial. I did want to point out we don't really talk about this in the expert level class. This other global edit option we cover in the advanced level class. But EndNote also has just a sort of a simple find and replace functionality as well. So if you maybe have a typo in a lot of references, instead of going reference by reference, if it's a consistent typo, you can actually just define it here and make the correction here if you'd like. But the change move copy fields option would let you not look for something to change, would let you add information to multiple references at once, like I said, a custom keyword, or copy or move information from one field to another.